Welcome to Cut to the Chase with Rob Chase. Brought to you by the InlandNorthwestReport.com. Alternative news and opinion for the Inland Northwest. And now, here's your host, Rob Chase.
This is Rob Chase with Cutting to the Chase, brought to you by InlandNorthwest.com, InlandNorthwestReport.com. Today our guest is David Wallace, and David was a participant in the early civil rights movement, so let's cut right to the chase. And David, tell us about how you got started in the early civil rights movement. Not the early civil rights movement, but you got along, but in the 1960s. It doesn't seem long ago, but actually now it has been quite a while ago.
Yeah, it does. As time passes too fast. Excuse me. I graduated from Texas A&M in 1961, and by then the Montgomery bus boycott had taken place in 1955 in Montgomery, Alabama. That brought Dr. Martin Luther King to prominence. Of course, that was after the Supreme Court decision of Brown versus Board of Education that ruled that segregated schools was illegal. Mm-hmm. And a side note to that, my high school in Pecos, Texas was one of the first schools to integrate in the state of Texas shortly thereafter. And because of that integration, I graduated in 1957 because of some of the players that came from the segregated schools took us to the state championship in basketball. Well, and that particular player, Bubba Ephraim, was recognized within the past 2 years by the Texas High School Athletic Hall of Fame as the first black player to play in the state tournament.
Well, I think of the civil rights movement, when things started to change, I think one of the people who made the most headway was Jack Johnson, the boxer, who
Yes.
they just couldn't find anybody to beat him, and they wanted to beat him so badly, but he, was kind of his own man, and interesting story. But a lot of the black athletes, that's how they kind of got there and became heroes, I
Right?
think, and that's how they, Jesse Owens, and of course, who was the guy who beat Max Schmeling? I shouldn't have. He's my father's favorite boxer, but I can't think of his name right now. But
Joe Louis.
Joe Louis, yeah. And my father was always convinced Joe Louis could have beaten up Muhammad Ali, but I don't know. We'll see.
And living in Chicago 20 years, I had a chance to meet people like Muhammad Ali and Joe Louis. Jesse Owens worked for the city of Chicago, and I did too at the same time. In fact, we had a summer youth program called the Jesse Owens Games. And the man that ran second to him, Ralph Metcalf, was an alderman and later a congressman from the city of Chicago.
Yeah. Well, there was, in fact, I think Max Schmeling, had his friend, what was his name again, the boxer?
Joe Louis.
Joe Louis. He was penniless when he died, but Max Schmeling from Germany sent the money over for the funeral to have him buried, because they had been friends, after the war even, and became close. But so besides sports figures, though, did you know Ralph Abernathy, for instance?
Yes,
Okay.
Dr. Abernathy was number 2 man in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Dr. King's best friend.
Was there a falling out or something at some point, or did they get together again?
Not with them.
Not with them. Okay.
In fact, if I remember correctly, Dr. Abernathy was also in Montgomery, and then he and Dr. King both moved to Atlanta. Ralph or Dr. Abernathy had a Baptist church. It seemed to me it was First Baptist Church in Atlanta. I may be wrong on the name, but then Dr. King went to the church that his father was pastor, Ebenezer Baptist Church.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. Now, how did you actually get involved? It was kind of unusual, wasn't it, for someone at that time, a white person, to be marching? I know I've seen pictures of some, but you must have been an anomaly at the time.
Well, I was already conscious and concerned about the whole racial situation. They'd grown up that way. But in 1956, I went to summer school in New York as a YMCA training school at Union Theological Seminary, and it was after the Montgomery bus boycott, and another fellow student from Texas A&M and I arranged our trip home on the bus to stop in Montgomery, and we went to Dr. King's church. He was still pastoring at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery. And we met him, and we knew that he was speaking at a National Student Christian Federation conference during the Christmas holidays, 1959 and 60. And we told him we would see him there, and we did. But I had no idea in just a few years I would be working for him at that point.
What amazed me about him was how so young he was.
Yes.
At the time. Of course, I was a kid when he was doing that, so everybody seemed old.
Right. I think he was about 24 in Montgomery.
Yeah.
When he was the older folks there did not. Well, I guess they didn't have the energy or the desire to take on that leadership, and Dr. King was the new kid on the block, I guess you might say, in the black community.
Was his father senior? Was he as effective, or was he
well,
doing that too?
He was in Atlanta,
Okay.
and Martin Jr. was in Montgomery.
Okay.
That was his first church, and so he had been there just a short period of time when the Montgomery bus boycott had started, and Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on the bus, and that ignited the fuse, and they formed the Montgomery Improvement Association, and the boycott went on for over a year, and finally went to the Supreme Court, and they won the Supreme Court. I'm familiar with this because I wrote a paper on it during college, and that's what encouraged me to want to stop in Montgomery and meet Dr. King. And then shortly thereafter, he moved to Atlanta, and one of the reasons he moved not only is to become associate pastor with his father, but also to form the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And Dr. Abernathy also went, and they were the president and vice president of SCLC. And it was composed of ministers, mainly Southern ministers.
SCLC?
Southern Christian Leadership Conference.
Okay.
And although there were some board members from New York and Indianapolis and Chicago and elsewhere, Dr. King had graduated from Morehouse University in Atlanta, and he had connections throughout the country, and of course he'd gone to his own seminary and done his doctoral work in the Boston area, and so he had extensive contacts throughout.
And had you gone to Union Theological Seminary in New York?
That's just a summer school.
Oh, summers. Now, wasn't that where Dietrich Bonhoeffer had gone before the war?
Yes, yes, he taught there. Reinhold Niebuhr, who was a great theologian back in the 30s, and very much involved in the labor movement back then, taught.
So you probably met people that knew them when they had been there.
Yes, and then when I graduated from college, I went to East Africa for 2 years.
Okay. And what a country?
Well, it was Tanganyika then. It was a former German colony up until World War I. And then when Germany lost, it became a protectorate of the United Nations assigned to Britain.
Is it still called Tanganyika?
No.
Okay. Or Tanzania?
It's called Tanzania now. Okay. They formed a union between Tanganyika and Zanzibar, the island of Zanzibar, to become Tanzania.
Yeah.
And that took place shortly after I left in '63.
Okay. Was the uprising going on with Kenyatta in Kenya at that time?
That was in the 50s.
In the 50s, okay.
Yes. Yeah. But when we got there, I went over with a dozen American young people like myself who were recent college graduates. And Jomo Kenyatta was still in jail. His number two person, Tom and Boy, I was trying to think of the name of their party, Kenyan African National Union, I believe, KANU. He was of a different tribe, but they were trying to bring the two big tribes, the Kikuyu and the Luo, together.
Who were the Mau Maus, or was that a...
Well, it was basically Kikuyu,
Okay.
as I understand it.
Yeah,
And it was really a civil war among the tribes and in the tribe. The news media tried to make it out as major uprising against whites. And Kenya, being a crown colony, it did had a lot of resources, beautiful country, a lot of farmers and others there. And there were some killings,
right.
And among the whites.
Was it Christian versus Muslim? Was that
no
tribal?
No, it's more tribal than religious, as I understand it.
Well, my friend Matt Shea was just over there in Ethiopia a few months ago, and they were in the middle of a war between two Christian warring tribes that were warring with each other. But before he left, they had made peace for the first time in like a decade. So, but we tend to think of it, having a religious orientation. Say the Islamists versus the Christians, or maybe even the animists. That thing there too. But that would have been a good training ground, I think, before he went back to the States to have seen that.
Yeah. So when I came back, that's when I entered Chicago Theological Seminary.
Okay.
Upon my return here, and Jessie Jackson was also a student there. We lived in the same floor in the dorm at that time. And when Bloody Sunday took place in March of 1965, the Civil Rights Act was enacted in 1964. That grew out of the demonstrations prior to then, including Birmingham, where they turned the fire hoses on the dog and the dogs on the
protesters,
children. Protesters. And you had Bull Connor running the show down there. Yeah. And that resulted in the Civil Rights Act. And then Selma started in 65 in pursuit of voting rights. And Bloody Sunday took place when a group of demonstrators were going to cross the river on Edmund Pettus Bridge, and they were met by I've forgotten the sheriff's name there, but...
Well, you mentioned Bull Connor.
Yeah, he was in Birmingham.
Pettus? No, the bridge was Pettus.
The bridge was Edmund Pettus Bridge. And they were met by the state police. Well, George Wallace was governor at that time. Right. And they were met by the state troopers and the sheriff and local police on horseback. And they had some tear gas and billy clubs, and they told the people to turn around and go back in the middle of the bridge, and then they waded into them with their horses. And John Lewis, who's now been a congressman for 50 years or so, was one of the leaders on that, and he got some knots on his head from that day.
Oh wow! Yeah. And it was nonviolent. I mean, they weren't agitating.
They were bowing down, praying, and there was on the news that night, and it so challenged the nation that 50,000 Americans showed up in the next few days in Selma. Jessie came down to my room, and we figured, we were wringing our hands. And so we started organizing, and we took a quarter of our student body and a third of our faculty and caravan down to Selma.
From Chicago.
From Chicago. Okay. Our president was going to go, and he tried to discourage us. You guys need to stay here and study for your finals are coming up. And but our church history professor said, sometimes it's good to get caught in the act.
Yeah, sometimes it's better to make history instead of study history.
Yes, and so we said, we're going to go. And so we did. We took 3 or 4 cars.
And you never regretted it, did you?
No, it changed my life. And on our way, we were down there about 3 days, and Jessie became very tight with the SELC staff. particularly Reverend C.T. Vivian. But we met all those staff, and we were busy. Part of the whole group down there. We were down there, a Unitarian minister from the Boston area, Reverend Reeb, was killed, was beaten to death there in Selma.
Yeah.
And there was another woman from the Detroit area, Viola Luzzo, who was picking up and ferrying civil rights leaders from the airport and various places.
Were you specifically targeted as a young white man marching with blacks then down there?
Not in a sense, yes. Those of us who were, and of course most of the CTS delegation was white. But we weren't out wandering around the community.
Right.
We pretty much stayed
put there.
with this, stayed put, and there were some marches while we were there. However, we never got over the bridge.
How do you support yourselves? I mean, students are always starving, aren't they? And
Well, yeah. I had my wife was working, which helped, and then when we went on Dr. King's staff, we had a stipend. Short, it was a minuscule stipend, but it kept things together. And on our way home, we decided, several of us decided that we were going to get involved in the civil rights movement in Chicago. And Jessie started searching out churches to where could we kind of land as kind of a headquarters type thing, and scouted out some churches. I know I was working in migrant ministry that summer, so I was working and getting paid. And he found a church, Fellowship Baptist Church, and he and the pastor hit it off, and they were really strong. And when Dr. King decided to go to a northern city, Chicago won out on that. Other cities were vying for Dr. King's attention, but the civil rights leadership in Chicago demonstrated that we might have a better deal there.
was it
and more
mostly
unified.
Baptists then?
No,
Down there? Was there other denominations that got involved?
very much other denominations, and
Well, you mentioned Unitarians, so.
yes, well, that pastor was killed, and there were people from all over the country, Episcopalians, Catholics, Methodists, all Baptists, all kinds. I don't know, the Unitarians. You'd see people, the women in the habits, there were nuns in the habits.
Nuns, yeah.
And in fact, I was wearing a collar at that point. Most of us as seminarians were. And we probably naively thought that would give us a measure of protection. I'm not sure, from the local folks, that they
Maybe
might
more of a
be
target.
Yeah, that's right. We realized that might have happened.
Now, were you on Dr. King's staff then?
Yes, after he decided to come to Chicago, one of our seminary professors was also involved in the civil rights movement. He was the staff assistant to the head of the civil rights movement there. And Jessie and I were in his class. He taught Reinhold Niebuhr's class on Moral Man and Immoral Society was his book, when he talked about the labor unions, and he quoted some of Gandhi, and Dr. King had studied Gandhi. So Jess and I entered the Urban Training Center for Christian Mission. We were the first two seminarians to participate in that program. They basically wanted to train urban ministers in community organizing and things like that. They didn't want seminarians. They thought we were too young and green and had no experience. Well, we were admitted. We had good clout, I guess you might say, for our seminary professors.
A lot of energy.
Yeah, and our president backed us to go. And we learned community organizing. Saul Alinsky was an important community organizer in Chicago. We were not learning the Alinsky method, but he did lecture to us. We did meet him. And our seminary professor that I mentioned had been involved in his neighborhood and on the south side of Chicago, just south of the University of Chicago. So he was very familiar with the Ulinsky method. And he recommended, the seminary professor recommended Jessie and I to go on Dr. King's staff because they needed some local involvement in that program. And so we happened to be the ones that were selected. We were trained community organizers. And
were you there for any of Dr. King's famous speeches?
yes, he had 2 or 3 rallies, major rallies at Soldier Field in Chicago, where we had 50, 60, 70,000 people there. But also, we later organized mass meetings in the community and stuff. When Jessie and I finished our training at the Urban Training Center, we were assigned to a South Side community just north of University of Chicago.
So you were pretty close to Jesse Jackson then.
Oh, Jessie and I, we were like bed, peas in a pod.
Right.
At that time, we did a lot of things together, and
Are you still in touch with?
yeah,
Okay.
probably talk with him at least once or twice a year.
Okay.
Various things. He now has Parkinson's disease,
Oh, that's too bad.
and he's slowing down a lot, but I'm told he still outruns most folks and has more energy than him. But unfortunately, last time I saw him, he has no smile. Has no smile because his face is.
He can't form a smile because of his disease.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Not his attitude. Just
It's just basically that. And he doesn't have a lot of tremor. He has some, but he does need help getting up out of his chair and stuff. And
who were some of the other people you met? You meet that might have Malcolm X, for instance. Was he?
no, I didn't.
Started out with you, or
No, I did
or
not meet
hovering
him. He
around,
was in
or-
New York.
Okay. Oh, that's right. He was in New York. Yes.
And so I did not meet him. I remember the night he was assassinated.
Mhm.
I know Jessie was really distraught.
Mhm.
He came around and told me about it
Yeah.
happening because I'd not heard the news that day, and he was really distraught at that.
Was it Elijah Muhammad?
Right, he lived in
Was
Chicago. We
okay.
lived in the same neighborhood.
Oh, okay.
And Cassius Clay or Muhammad Ali.
Right.
So that we met them, and I had some good friends who were out of that not temple.
Yeah.
The Islamic
the mosque.
mosque.
Yeah.
Mosque. That's the word I was trying to think of. Yeah.
How about Stokely Carmichael? Was he? I know some of them started out with Dr. King, but maybe out of frustration or whatever, then
Well,
it started
Stokely-
taking on more of a violent.
He was one of the heads of Student Nonviolent Coordinating
Right,
Committee.
SNCC, I think.
SNCC, that group started in Nashville, and right after the students at North Carolina A&T had the first sit-in in 1960, the Nashville crew was ready to go in, and they jumped into action. And they had been in training. A Methodist minister who had spent time in India and knew that this might be, studied Gandhi, and knew that this might be a way to help break the back of
Well, he didn't have much to
segregation.
go on. I think mostly Gandhi by that time. There's all kind of like innovation, experimental. I mean, how it
Right.
was going to go.
Right, but at least he had the training and
Uh-huh.
the knowledge of it and his theological background. He put it all together and figured, this might be a way to go. And so he was able to start training some students in Nashville from Fisk, from American Theological Seminary, which is a little small Baptist seminary, very poor compared to Fisk, and Tennessee State, I believe, was also there. But he pulled together a cadre of students, and John Lewis was in that group, James Bevel, who became, and several of those key initial people became student organizers, or became organizers with Southern Christian Leadership Conference with Dr. King, and then others in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, where Stokely Carmichael and them came in later.
Now, King's speech, you know, I looked over the mountaintop. I think it was the speech he gave before he was assassinated, wasn't it? Do you think he had a vision or somehow a feeling he was going to die pretty quickly? It almost seemed
He
like
he had death threats.
It was prophetic, you know.
Were not new to him.
Right.
For some time. In fact, his home was bombed in Montgomery several years earlier. So the threats on his life were frequent.
Were you part of that when Kennedy was assassinated, or were you over in Kenya at the time?
No, I had just come back from Chicago, and was enrolled in Chicago Theological Seminary that fall, and I was on my way. I was going over to take a graduate exam a few blocks away at the YMCA college there in Chicago, when I passed a storefront and heard the news and had to go take an exam, wondering, you know, the
Well, you
devastation.
took an exam because
Boy, that
everything
was,
just kind of came to a standstill. I think it probably like younger people today.
Yeah.
Our moment was the Kennedy assassination.
Right.
Their moment was 9/11.
Yeah,
For
right.
instance, probably were.
because Kennedy was
yeah.
my first vote,
Uh-huh.
and I voted, and then went to Africa 2 years. So a lot of things. Well, but we'd get Time magazine and Newsweek, the international editions,
Yeah.
every week to try to keep up
Now,
with what was going
wasn't
on.
Jesse Jackson with King when he's assassinated, or were
Yes.
you with him too, or
No,
were you still in Chicago?
Only by the grace of God. There were several. Jesse and several of our colleagues were in Memphis. I could have been there, but Jesse chose another friend, Gary, who now lives down in
Was it
Corvallis.
because he had tried to do it the nonviolent way and get assassinated himself? Was that like the frustration that then came out in '68 with H. Rap Brown and some of the other leaders? The Black Panthers, I think, kind of maybe started emerging shortly after that too.
Well, there was a strong difference of opinion,
Uh-huh.
particularly some of the younger. But at the same time, the Jim Bevels and the John Lewises and all that group were part of Dr. King's group, compared with the Stokely Carmichaels and those that wanted to go the more H. Rap Brown,
Right.
the Black Panthers and stuff. There's just a great divide there.
Yeah, it's a difference of opinion, you know. What the best strategy is going to be, and of course, I think Dr. King is at least remembered more than, you know. I don't know how many people would still remember H. Rap Brown today.
Right.
Yeah.
Or even how many.
And of course, then shortly after that, Robert Kennedy was assassinated.
Yeah.
So, no, you were there during the '68 riots, weren't you, in Chicago?
In Chicago, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. What's your memory of those, and how did that get going? So,
Well, when Dr. King was assassinated, and it didn't take long before Chicago was burning, and much of the west side of Chicago. We were on the south side mainly, but much of the west side.
well, as I recall, remember I think I was 14 back then, but a lot of the cities lit up, you know.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
especially Watts in L.A. and you know, a lot of those areas. And of course, we all remember Chicago because of the Democratic Convention. And you probably, who was the mayor at that time?
Mayor Richard J. Daley.
Daley.
Called
yeah.
Boss Daley.
Boston.
And he issued the orders shoot to kill.
Oh, he did? Okay.
Yes, he did. I mean, it was
But there weren't
right.
very many fatalities. There was probably a lot of heads lost.
I don't remember on
Yeah.
that, but yeah, there were some fatalities,
Mhm.
and I'm not sure that they were necessarily from police gunshots.
Oh, okay, yeah.
But he came under serious criticism for that.
Mhm.
And then when the Democratic Convention came, we knew to stay out of the way. Because you had the hippies and the yippies, and there were several other groups. They were camped out in Lincoln
right.
Park, which was on the north side,
Mhm.
and President Johnson sent in the National Guard. They were camped out in Washington Park, which was on the south side, right by the University of Chicago. That was the neighborhood where I lived.
Yeah.
And so we would have to drive through there and see them bivouacked out there, the tents and stuff. And they had Jeeps with racks, kind of big steel racks in front with barbed wire around them, that I presume they could have used to move into a crowd and
Oh, I suppose so.
help move them back.
Yeah.
And so we tried
Well,
to stay
I
out
think
of stuff.
'67 was a summer of love, and then '68 was so many things were happening.
there
You
was
know, I
a-
think they started out the Tet Offensive, and
Mm-hmm.
we had our ship that was hijacked by North Korea
Mhm.
at the same time up there, and then the assassination of King and Kennedy too, and the
Right.
Chicago riots. 1968 was one of those, you could say, pregnant years
Oh,
where so much
yes.
was going on.
Yeah.
And then Nixon got elected in '68 too. So, okay, and we were withdrawing from the Vietnam War, just starting to. I think it's kind of like that's when people started realizing, hold up, like, why we've supported this thing, but the body counts were just so
Yeah,
high, we weren't
right,
seeming to
really.
make any progress. So there's a lot of frustration, I think, in America at that
Yeah,
time. Now,
frustration.
at that time too, especially frustration with the people in the movement. Were you starting to be marginalized then as a white person as part of that, or
Things started hardening.
yeah?
Yeah, they did start hardening.
Okay.
And I remember walking down the street. We were on 47th Street, which is right in the heart of the black community.
Uh-huh.
And I got stuff thrown at me at that time.
Yeah.
And you know, those who knew me, it was no problem. But those who didn't,
Right.
I mean, you
Yeah.
know, you're an outsider.
Yeah, a lot of
Well,
difference, say, between 1964 and 1968.
Yeah.
I think. Yeah. A lot happened. Attitudes changed, but it all seemed to kind of blow up. Then, of course, 1970 you had Kent State, you know, and some of these other things, but it kind of simmered off, you know, and later into the 1970s it was somewhat mild, I think, and all that. But because I think actually a lot of the progress had been made. I think, you know, a lot of the racism, you know, was still prevalent, I think, amongst maybe the older generations, but it didn't seem, you know, as pronounced as it had, you know, back with the Jim Crow laws. Of
Yeah,
course.
there was some movement, yeah, in terms of dealing with such laws and legal situation.
Uh-huh.
But the social conditions really were very, very slow, and employment.
Oh yeah.
Even though the economy was good
Uh-huh.
at that time, we had low unemployment. However, that was not necessarily true in the black community at that time. So that poverty was still pretty high, and frustrations were pretty high. The schools in Chicago had been a major source of concern for years, and that's where the civil rights movement in Chicago had really gotten its impetus back in late 50s, early 60s, and it was that group pushing for better schools that formed the nucleus of Chicago civil rights movement that invited Dr. King to come.
Yeah.
And
And in retrospect, what went right and what went wrong? I mean, looking back, what did you guys do right, and what did you wish you could have done differently, maybe?
well, I think, excuse me, the very fact that we stepped out there and began pulling people together, and people began to see that there was an opportunity to act together to bring about change. There was economic power. There was some political power in terms of utilizing the vote, getting people to register and vote using the buying power, as part of their economic power, could change things that happened in those companies that had products and services for sale, but they weren't contributing anything in the community. Black people were not employed in a lot of those companies, and they weren't using black services. The garbage men, for example, black garbage companies could not pick up garbage in their own neighborhoods, and that's part of what we dealt with, and began to open those kinds of doors, so that those were people begin to see that there are things that we can do, and things that we did do, that began to open those doors.
Would you say nonviolence is more effective, really, in the?
Certainly at that time. Would it be now? I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know. I think
If you get press, there was a lot of press back then, and a lot of times you don't really can't count on the Fourth Estate too.
But the interesting thing, the Metropolitan Press in Chicago did not pay attention to us. We would be doing a lot of things in the community, but they didn't. You know, we'd alert them to. We're having press conferences. We're going to have them do this and do that, demonstrations or whatever. They didn't cover us. So what we did is that I wrote the releases. We had a photographer, and we took photographs of various activity. And Chicago has extensive neighborhood papers in black community, white community, right on around the Horn. We would hand deliver those to the black neighborhood papers, and usually it'd be the front page story. It'd be the primary content of those newspapers, and then we would collect those and cut and make reprints. And we started sending those reprints. We'd packet them up and send them off to New York Times, Washington Post, CBS, NBC, Time Magazine, et cetera, And then, hey, look at this stuff. Boy, this stuff's really going on in Chicago. They'd call the Chicago Tribune, Chicago Sun, what's going on in Chicago? I don't know. They were ignorant.
Now, Harry Truman called the Chicago Tribune the worst paper.
Yeah, right. But they forced what they did by us going to the national press and them calling back to Chicago, forced the Chicago Metropolitan Press to have to get out there and find out what was going on.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of funny.
Well, there's an author, Studs Terkel. He was from Chicago too. Maybe you met him. I don't know.
Oh yeah.
He wrote. Oh, really? Okay. He wrote a book called The Good War, and in it, one of the soldiers who'd been part of this Allied landing, and they had liberated the French towns, and the mademoiselles were hugging them and kissing them, and the bells were ringing in the churches, and he said that was like the zenith of his life, and then suddenly the war was over, and he went back and worked in a factory. So those heady years that you were involved, is that kind of like what happened after that? It kind of slowed down?
Well, Studs was an icon by the time I got to Chicago.
Okay.
And I first became heard of him that he had gone. There was a trainload of people that went from Chicago to Washington, D.C. for the March on Washington in 1963.
Yeah.
And Studs did a radio piece called Our Train on his radio station, WFMT. And that's the first I'd ever heard of him, and it's fascinating. He was interviewing people all the way, and during the march, and then on the way back. It was about a 2-hour radio program, and then Studs always wore a red and white check shirt, with a blue blazer, and with his white hair, and you would see him various places. I mean, he was always out and about.
What other figures were around Chicago at that time that you met?
Muhammad Ali.
Okay. What do you think of him?
And he was fun.
It seemed he was such a sharp wit.
Yes, he was.
In addition to being a boxer.
He was fun. We later started several artists there in the singers and rock and roll artists there in the community. We started program. Our Operation Breadbasket met every week, every Saturday morning.
Oh, okay.
And eventually we got and artists and politicians would come.
We probably had some of the folk singers
folk singers.
Was
Yeah,
Bob Dylan there? And,
no, but
Okay.
the Staple Singers were.
uh-huh.
You familiar with the Staple Singers?
No, Peter, Paul, Mary.
And Bill Cosby and from his I Spy days
Right.
with who was the
Robert
guy?
Culp.
Robert Culp.
Uh-huh.
He and Robert Culp were there. Cannonball Adderley cut a album called "The Country Preacher" at our Saturday morning meeting. Some of the politicians, virtually all the politicians during the campaigns would come by there.
How about Mahalia Jackson?
Mahalia
Was she
Jackson,
there?
very much so.
Ethel Waters?
Yes,
Okay.
Oh,
Paul
was that?
Robeson. Was he?
No,
No,
he
okay.
did not come by. You know, before Dr. King was assassinated, we were having our Saturday morning meeting, but it was very small at that point. Eartha Kitt was there.
Oh, okay.
Santa Baby,
Uh-huh. Yeah,
sing
I like
that
her.
song. But she came, and that was a real surprise that I had met her.
Mm-hmm.
But virtually all the Adlai Stevenson, the third, his son was the state treasurer of the state of Illinois
Okay.
at one point. He was there, and of course the governors and senators and those folks running for office. Mayor Daley didn't come though.
Oh no, I wouldn't. So what do you do now then? After all that, what do you settle into finally?
I'm retired and lived here in Spokane. We moved to the Northwest in 1991. Lived up in Stevens County a dozen years. Been here in Spokane, and had worked with Eastern Washington University in a federal grant program until it ran out. And,
Okay.
worked here in Spokane with the Union Gospel Mission.
Mhm.
Also helped build Palisades Christian Academy, a Seventh-day Adventist school over on Government Way,
Yeah.
and
Yeah,
did
driven by-
fundraising on that. And that was probably one of the most fun jobs I've ever had. And I've been retired for a few years. I'm coordinator of the World
But you're
Prayer
a
Team.
prayer warrior.
I work on
What
it.
does that mean? I mean,
Well, we have a sign that's fairly new. It says, "You want to change the world? Pray."
mhm.
And so the World Prayer Team meets weekly, and we pray around the world, and have guests come in and share what their ministry is and what they're doing. We've had people from all over the world, and I remember one particular man, Nathan Georgie from Cairo, Egypt, and he happened to be a guest of Reverend Daniel Grether here in Spokane, and Nathan came to the World Prayer Team, and he says I go all over the Middle East, and I appreciate what you do because you pray for the nations.
Right. All
we
nations.
need pray for the nations.
Yeah, that's what God said. All nations.
Yes,
know,
and
have His
so
presence.
we have people from overseas as well as people from the United States. In fact, in a week, in another week we'll be welcoming a pastor from Vietnam. Vietnam is not a Christian country.
Mhm.
And they're not too friendly to any evangelism in that country.
Right.
But this young man is a pastor there, and will be in this country for 3 or 4 months, getting some training
Yeah.
to take back to his country. So
Okay.
we're looking forward to welcoming him.
Well, maybe some of our people watching this would, like to come to your prayer team once in a while and pray across the globe as it turns and
Indeed,
listen
we're
to an
certainly-
interesting guest.
Certainly open. We meet at Life Center Church at 1202 North Government Way. We meet starting at 9:30 on Wednesday mornings.
Mhm.
Just about every Wednesday, except maybe 2 or 3 days, depending on how the holidays fall.
Yeah, how deep the snow is. I suppose.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, David, for sharing your reminiscences with us, and that was very interesting. You saw a part of history most of us can only read about. But anyway, thank you for coming to cut to the chase, and let's not forget to pray first.
Amen. Thank you, Rob.
Thank you.
This has been Cut to the Chase with Rob Chase, where we cover anything under the sun that would be of interest to you, our viewers. Cut to the Chase has been brought to you by the Inland Northwest Report.com, alternative news and opinion for the Inland Northwest. Don't forget to catch the Sunday edition of Cut to the Chase, where Rob interviews local pastors on Christian perspectives. Until next time, stay in prayer for God, family, and country.